Good evening, everybody. I'm Kay Gilbert from the Tennis Parents Community. That's a group of parents who've come together to try and work out for ourselves how to best support our children through this sport. We have 3,000 parents joining now on our Facebook group, and we also have a YouTube channel, which is a place where you can find about 20 or so of recordings like this with different experts from the world of tennis. And those are available to anybody who wants to access them, whether they're coaches, officials, parents from international, from outside of the UK as well. So if you aren't a member of our group already, do have a look for us, the Tennis Parents Community, and feel free to join us if you wish. This evening, um, our guest is Professor Camilla Knight. And whilst most researchers conclude that tennis parents are getting it wrong, as a former tennis player herself and as a parent, Camilla's focus has been on understanding the complexities of the situation that we all find ourselves in. Camilla has challenged what has been assumed about parental conduct when it's considered out of context and looked instead more closely at the complex and variable environmental factors driving our behaviour. Her work acknowledges the emotions and the pressure that parents feel and has examined the intention and the desire behind their behavioural choices. This has enabled her to offer advice on how to influence parents, which is rooted in research but very relevant still in reality, with the ultimate goal of enhancing the psychosocial experience of children in sport. Welcome to the Tennis Parents Community, Professor Camilla Knight.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Kate. Really excited to be here.
No, it's very kind of you to give up your Sunday evening, and we appreciate it. So perhaps we could start by asking you to share with us your experience as a young tennis player growing up in Devon, and also how your parents supported you and your brother.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, Kay, I grew up in Devon. I was very fortunate that we actually lived opposite some tennis courts, and so I think the natural thing to do was to play some tennis. And actually, me, my brother, and my sister all started out playing. My dad was a good sportsman and really keen on us being active, so we started out. My sister decided it wasn't for her. Me and my brother carried on a little bit longer. But I was the one who really had that passion. And so, my parents, as I'm sure all of the parents on this call, they committed a lot of time, most weekends driving around the country to a tournament or another. My mum staying at home and my dad taking me. I remember sitting Sunday nights. Mum would say, "You fill in the tournament entry. I'll get the checkbook out." Getting me to training, all of those sorts of things. But also, I think the most important piece was being there when it was kind of going well and when it wasn't going well. So, my dad was an expert at knowing when to say nothing, and that was often. And he also was, great at being very balanced in sort of the response. But I always laugh, like he would sit on the sidelines reading his newspaper, and I would think he would have no idea what was going on in the match, but he knew exactly what was going on. But he had that newspaper there, and he looked, really chilled out, and that was the way that worked for us. So, hugely supportive all of the way through, all the way. And then at 18, I decided to go to the States to play tennis, and they were supportive in me making that decision as well. So, yeah, they're very heavily involved, as I'm sure all of the parents on this call are.
That's a really interesting physical barrier to put up, isn't it? A newspaper, and presumably he could hide behind it occasionally to pull faces or whatever. But
Yeah,
yeah,
to be fair, he has a teacher, and I don't know if it's because he was a teacher, but he had a very neutral face. He was very good at keeping it very calm. I'm sure inside it wasn't calm. I was not the easiest of players to watch. I showed every emotion, so I'm sure for him as a parent, it was tough. It was tough. I know my mum found it challenging. That's why she never came to watch. So she never watched. And she always says that she loved it when mobile phones came in because she knew if I text I'd lost and she didn't have to talk to me while I was upset. But if the phone rang, she knew in advance that meant I'd won because I wanted to talk about the match. So yeah, I remember she was very pleased when we moved away from stopping at payphones to call her on the way home.
that's so funny. Do you know? I had a ringtone for my son specifically, and my stomach used to churn when that ringtone rang, because it would be to say his result. And I don't know why, because it didn't really matter, but just that tension in that moment. I had to change the ringtone eventually because I couldn't. And to this day, if I hear that ringtone, it makes me go a bit. Oh, but yeah, crazy stuff. So you went on to study after the US at Loughborough, didn't you? And then back to the States in Alberta. Can you tell us a bit more about that part of your tennis journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did. It was yeah, the trend initially was everyone in my kind of tennis era was going to the States, so I went over to the States to do it because everyone was. Did 1 year there, it didn't work out, and I decided I would come back to Loughborough because I already had that. So then I decided to study sports science, and I played tennis all the way through, and I was club captain for the tennis team, and I was coaching, and I was doing, I think, all the things I assumed a student who was interested in tennis would be doing. And it was great. It was really nice to play in a team. I think, that was something that was really valuable for me. It was always interesting though, playing at university, the number of players who I'd grown up with who get to university and then quit when they no longer had their parents there helping them get to everything and they had the choice. So yeah, I did the 3 years of undergrad and my master's there at Loughborough, playing all of the way through, before having a year coaching, realized I could not be a tennis coach. I was not patient enough or creative enough. I hadn't realized how creative coaches needed to be. A couple hours in and I was recycling coaching sessions. So then I had the good fortune to be able to travel to University of Alberta to do my PhD. Um, and I wouldn't have predicted it at that time, but I did an entire PhD in tennis parents, which is always nice to have an opportunity to really examine your passions. So 4 years there, coaching, playing, awesome to play in Canada, and their university competitions, their national finals actually happen at the Rogers Cup. So it was super cool for 4 years to go and play at the Rogers Cup alongside men and women. They flip it around each year. So yeah, I have to say I really, really enjoyed all of the opportunities that tennis has given me.
No, and sorry, I made the mistake there of thinking Alberta was in America. So thank you for correcting me
No,
on
I
that.
didn't even realize. I didn't realize you'd.
I could have got away with it. So after your PhD, you took up a post at Swansea University in sports psychology. Could you give us an overview of the research projects that you led during your time at Swansea?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if I just backpedal a little bit, I should have mentioned actually all the way from my undergrad, I started to study parents. So when I was first doing my undergrad at Loughborough, I did my first two research studies looking at the stress tennis parents experienced. And that really paved the way for everything I did after. So then my PhD, as I said, was looking at how we optimize parental involvement. And then when I started at Loughborough, started at Swansea, it was straight back into understanding the stresses that parents experienced, understanding how parents cope with the different challenges they encounter. I've had some PhD students who we've had embedded in different organizations, exploring kind of the parent experience in different sports and how we might work with parents to try and enhance their experiences, all the way through to actually being really heavily involved with the child protection in sport unit and helping them with a lot of the research underpinning some of their work when they used to have parents in sport week. So a real variety across the 13 years that I was there.
And you mentioned how we can support parents. Who is it you were advising?
So I've been really fortunate to work with sort of local, national, regional, international organisations. So, worked very closely with Sport Wales here, where I'm based in Swansea still. So worked very closely with Sport Wales and a number of the different sports there. Worked with Singapore Tennis Federation, worked a lot with Sport New Zealand. For strange reasons, that came about fortuitously, but they were, really keen in using research. Worked across a European project, so lots of different countries. So, that for me was always the passion. I think I said to UK when we first met, as an academic, I was frustrated that I was sitting around with knowledge that I thought was useful for others. So, I've always tried to reach out and engage with different organizations as much as I can.
That's amazing. And you know, you mentioned multiple sports there, of course, as well, not just tennis, but the emotional climate between parents and their child is very dynamic and tricky area, isn't it? What do you think best practice looks like, just as a sort of starter for 10? Because obviously we're going to get into a lot more detail as we go along, but what do you think best practice looks like from what you've learned?
So we will get into it, and you started in the introduction with recognizing that I appreciate complexity and nuance, and that's absolutely fundamental to the relationship. But at its core, at the core of kind of best practice around sort of sport parenting, it's about acting in a manner that's responsive, and that's unique to a child. So I think, it's really, really easy for parents to get caught up in comparisons, in thinking about what others are doing, in forward forward thinking. But fundamentally, the very best parents get their kid, and they really understand, what is the my child's goal? Are we on the same page with it? Am I showing them continually that I value them, that I care for them, and I love them in relation to what it is that they want to achieve? And that's it's easier said than done, but like at its core, it's that. And to be able to do that, it's communication. And um, as parents, we often think that we know what our child wants, or we think that what we're doing is being perceived positively. But research continually tells us that what parents are doing isn't necessarily perceived by children in the way that it's intended. So we can think we're being really supportive, and it's interpreted entirely differently. And so, that communication to make sure you're on the same page is absolutely key.
And obviously that changes as your child grows older. And I sometimes felt like my kids kind of sussed things out before I did even. It's possible that you've got that dynamic between the two of you that evolves over time, and you find a rhythm and a way forward that perhaps in the early years you're still much more in a role of leading them, aren't you? Whereas as they get older, they want to lead themselves, and you need to develop that in them, which is the paradox, isn't it? That you then become the follower rather than the leader.
But that's absolutely key what you said there, Kate. So researchers like to say that parents become less important over time. They absolutely don't. Parents are critically important through the entire journey, all of the time. Just how you're important and what's required is the thing that shifts. And exactly as you said, early on as a parent, it's about providing opportunities. It's about seeing, where your child could train, what coaching they can access, what competitions they can access, making sure they've got the right kit. As your child gets older, it's about being that emotional supporter. It's about recognizing that actually your child and their coach are probably the ones who are driving things a little bit more, but you are absolutely fundamental in picking them up when it's not going well. So yeah, that shift in role, but still recognizing that you're absolutely critical is really important.
So many of the parents listening will be supporting their child through multiple sports. What are the sort of challenges that you have identified that are faced specifically by parents of junior tennis players compared, say, to other sports?
It's different having a child in a sport like tennis where they are very heavily reliant on you as a parent. In a team sport, if I crudely compared tennis to team sports, in team sports you've got opportunities to miss games and a match can still happen, or to work in that team setting. So you've got more of a team of parents, people sharing lifts, people kind of being able to kind of divvy out roles. And also for your child, it's a different experience. They can hide in a team sport. In tennis, it's absolutely brutal when it's not going well. You got to stay to the last point. You can't escape. You've got to keep, carry on playing. And that means you as a parent have to stay there too. And so, from the watching your child and recognizing the emotional experience your child is having, all the way through to fundamentally, if you as a parent aren't on that journey with your child, it's going to be tricky for them to be able to progress. That's what makes it unique in tennis. Your children really can't do it without you because of the way that, tennis is set up. And it is still quite an expensive sport. You do still need to kind of have flexibility to get to tournaments. And especially, when you're in the summer period and it's kind of long tournaments, there's a lot of demands that are placed on parents, which are quite different to other sports, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think parents are all nodding sagely when you say it's an expensive sport for sure, and sometimes deciding how we spend that budget to maximise our child's progress is quite important, or the experience they get. But yeah, I think also tennis it does rely on parents, but in a way that's part of its superpower as well, isn't it? Because I always think in another sport, if you don't get picked for county, you're kind of high and dry. Whereas in tennis, there are pathways to get into the
Mhm.
sport your own way almost, aren't there? You can be part of a central regional player development centre, or you can choose to carry on at your local club with a coach that you know and trust. And so there are the parent has got a lot more decisions that they could potentially make. Rather than you just being picked by somebody who can bankroll your progress either through an academy in football or something similar. I guess
And
that's a major difference as well, isn't it? That you are given
yeah,
responsibility as a parent.
and it's huge, right? That decision making, as a parent, you're making decisions all of the time. And that's what we found in our very first studies is this kind of developmental stresses. So parents needing to make decisions in tennis about, for instance, do we go to an academy? Do we go abroad? Do we do this tournament? Do we do that tournament? Should they go to the sleepover or should they go to the tournament? There is so many more options, which on the one hand is great, lots of different avenues to keep young people involved, which is fundamentally in my heart what we want to do. Most players aren't going to become professional, but giving them that love of sport and an opportunity to be active is really key. But making those decisions is hard when you're already making decisions every day. I can barely make decisions about what to have for dinner, let alone, well, which tournament do I do? And, if you get into that elite end, which country are we traveling to for, which tournament? So yeah, you're absolutely right, Kay. There's real positives there and like opportunities for parents to drive it. But I think it's also why for parents you can become so invested in it even without meaning to, right? Because you do make, a lot more of those decisions. You are much more of a kind of manager agent from a young age of, you know, trying to work it out as best you can. And, our research has shown that, lots of parents are working from trial and error, which is tough, right? It's really tough. We don't really want to work from trial and error. And often you try on the first kid and then you hopefully do it a bit better on the second one if you've been fortunate enough to have more than one child. And it's not probably how we would like to design a pathway through sport, but that bit isn't unique to tennis. I think every sport there's kind of trial and error, but when you've got so many decisions to make, it's challenging for sure.
And I think also we're effectively the sponsor as well, looking for this return on the investment that we're making, both in time and money. I think that adds another dynamic, doesn't it, to the sport? So, well, let's get involved in a bit more detail then with what you've learnt about how parents can positively impact their child's experience in tennis. We're really looking forward to hearing your tips on that. And I'll run through some questions that have been submitted by parents in advance. And if any parents on the call tonight have any questions they want to add, do feel free to put something into the chat or come off mute or raise a digital hand. But first of all, I don't think Cami is on the call, so I will ask that question for her. She asked, how can I teach my child to cope with losing matches or with frustration on the court? What do you think a parent's role is? What should they say and not say when the child is clearly emotionally upset and frustrated?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm smiling because that was me. As I said, I wore my emotions on my sleeve, and I really struggled. I had high expectations for myself, which I've never yet reached. And so every emotion was displayed on court, and I can only imagine as a parent just how tough it is to see it. Um, I think first and foremost, you don't say anything until your child is in a place where they want to say something. Um, so, what we would always recommend is that you discuss at a point when there are no emotions involved. You discuss with your child how you're going to kind of have conversations after the match, which is, all right, I'm gonna leave it to you. Like you can come and you can initiate the conversations, and straight away you can start to give your child some ownership over that, and you can do that from a young age. You can, I do it when I pick my son up from school. Do you want to talk about school yet or not? No. Okay. Tell me if you want to talk about the day. So you can immediately give that kind of ownership. And then, it's always going to be more positive to have those conversations when the emotions are a little bit calmer. In terms of kind of teaching them in advance how they might cope with frustrations or when they're losing, I think, what we would talk about a lot of is sport is always going to be about winning and losing. Like we can't get away from that. There's no point saying that it doesn't matter if you win or lose, because if you've trained a lot and if you're going out to play, most kids are going to want to win. But what we need to help children to understand is that it's not only about winning. And so, as a parent, the way that you go about having conversations leading up to it, the way that you help your child to understand how they might see progress in a different way. And for me, it's not just so lots of people will say, oh, just enjoy it. That's not it either, right? It's about going, you've been working hard to say, I know this is important. What is it that you want to go out and try? What is it that you're trying to show to yourself? And then as a parent, remaining really grounded to help them to see kind of where that progress has happened. I think it's also about sharing with your child some of your own experiences of how you might cope. As parents, we've been through loads of frustrations and we've often developed some strategies and, especially when your children are younger, helping them to just talk about it, to have some opportunities to think about that can be useful. And then finally, there's some really great sports psychology books out there, and some of the basic techniques around kind of like pre-point routines, breathing, kind of a bit of progressive muscular relaxation when you're out there. All of those things as a parent you can talk about. So there's some real behavioral techniques um, that can help as well. So I think what I'm saying in a very long-winded way is think about the conversations you're having leading in. So think about how you're setting up the environment so that you're minimizing pressure and you're helping your child to focus on the areas they want to improve and the areas they want to show success on. When they're on the court, it's about those behavioral techniques and trying to give them strategies to understand why they're playing and what they're enjoying about the game. And then after the matches, absolutely the conversation needs to start from them. And then, I think it's really about taking the lead from them. It's about reassuring them that, you saw them, you saw what they were doing well. If they want to talk about the things that they want to improve, then absolutely. Doesn't really help to tell them that I noticed that you were frustrated. They'll know they were frustrated, and that's a kind of a go-to that parents often do. So, following their lead and letting them initiate that conversation is key.
I remember a parent on our group once saying that they tell their child they're going to go to practice matches, not competitions. And just by reframing the purpose of what they're doing seemed to be a really good idea to me. Is that something that you would support?
Yeah, so that's about kind of reappraising a threat. So basically, we tend to have an emotional response when we experience the demands we're encountering as threatening or harmful. So that means when we're in a situation where we don't think we might be able to achieve our goals or our goals are feeling threatened. So in that case, maybe going out and winning. Um, in a competition by kind of encouraging a perception of a different environment, it might be seen as this is an opportunity where this situation is beneficial to my goals rather than threatening or harmful. I can absolutely see the benefit for that kind of in the short term, but long term, ultimately, it's about developing strategies to cope in competition. And what I would be encouraging if you've got a child who's really struggling in competition is trying to understand what it is about competition that they're really struggling with. Is it because they feel like they're being judged if they don't win? Do they feel like they're letting you down as parents? When they're going out, are they expecting perfect performances? That kind of idea of kind of perfect is something I talk about with athletes I work with because I'm an accredited sports psychologist as well. And you're never going to have a perfect match. And if you can come off a match having played 70% well, you're probably doing pretty well. But children don't know that. And a lot of the conversation around matches is about outcomes. And actually, as a parent, you never really need to discuss an outcome because that bit's always present. What you need to be talking about, there's all of the other pieces around, um, behavior, performance, all of the things that are under your control. So, it's short term, definitely I can see the benefits of reframing them as practice matches, but fundamentally, working out how to cope with competition is going to be key if you want to move forward in the pathway.
There's some great tips there on how to help your child to go through their emotional journey, both before and after. What about the parents themselves? Because they can often be dealing with their own emotions and stress around competition. Have you got any advice for us on managing our own mental health around competition?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where my research started. And it's I think the first thing is absolutely just accepting like it's tough, right? As a parent, there's very few, if any, other experiences you're in where you are watching your child win or lose or perform well or witnessing their emotions in the same way as you do in sport. You don't sit there when they do a maths test and see them put the wrong answers in, or you don't see them when they go in for a ballet exam, right? They go into a different room. So, first and foremost, it's about recognizing it's going to be an emotional experience. I think the next thing is then really recognizing that actually the emotions and the experience your child are experiencing, especially when they're younger, they last, they're fleeting, they're not as intense as they seem like they are, and actually they'll move on much quicker than us as parents. So I think the first, for me, it's key to just not get too hung up on the emotional response of your child. As parents, we're taught that our job is to make sure we have happy children. And I would just say, just try and reframe that. You're not, you're trying to help your child to be able to cope when it's challenging, right? Everybody is going to encounter challenging times, whether it's in sport or in life. But having this idea that you just want your child to be happy makes parenting really tricky. But having the idea that your job as a parent is to help them to be able to cope when it's challenging can be a really useful reframe. From a very practical perspective, some of the similar things that I said about your children will also apply for parents, breathing strategies, reframing of experiences. You mentioned, Kay, about that kind of return on investment that parents can feel. And I think it's really important as a parent to think about all of the different things that your child gets from tennis. The outcome of a match, especially the outcome of one match, is not a return on any investment. But if you take my story, the opportunity to go to the USA to do my studies around tennis, to have a fully funded masters because I was studying tennis, to go to Canada and travel around playing tennis, like those are the things you're investing in. If you happen to have a child who makes it to an elite level, brilliant. But all of those other experiences are really key. So as a parent, before competitions, before you're anywhere near them, take some time and really think about what it is you're hoping that you and your child will get out of it. At competitions, breathing techniques, finding friends, having some distractions, having really clear activities that you're going to do while your child is competing is really useful. Thinking about scenarios you might encounter, role playing them, having someone on the phone who you can call to get the frustration out before you talk to your child. There's no one technique that works, but playing through a few and then reflecting on them to see which ones work best is probably my best tip.
That's really good advice. Emily, I've seen that your hand's up. I'll come to you in one moment. But first of all, I'm just going to see whether Adam would like to ask the question that he's put in the chat here. Adam, would you like to come off mute? Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Good evening, everybody. Um, yeah, my question is there ever a point where a child's behavior is so bad that you should either remove them from the match court that they're actually on, or consider removing them from the competitive environment? How extreme would you say that their behavior would need to be in order to take that kind of action?
It's a great question, Adam. I'm reflecting on my mum doing exactly that with my brother at one tournament, and I think ultimately that's a parenting decision in terms of that threshold. I do think it's important that we recognize that there are probably certain standards of behavior that you as a parent are happy to see or not. And if it crosses your personal threshold, then absolutely. For me personally, I would say, if it's a behavior that you can deal with after a match, whether that's around having a conversation to understand behavior. I'm a big believer that behavior is always a means of communicating something. So if you're seeing behavior that you're really uncomfortable with from your child on court, then I would say, working with a sports psychologist or trying to work it through as a parent to understand what's underpinning that behavior would be key. And that might mean coming out of a competitive environment for a while you work out what was kind of underpinning it. It would have to be pretty bad for me for you to intervene during a match, just because of the potential of that being kind of quite a public setting and quite a having the potential to lead to other kind of negative consequences. But I think, the threshold ultimately has to be the one that's set by you as a parent. But if you're seeing behavior that's really concerning, it's probably underpinned by high competitive anxiety, frustration, anger, and it might not even be related to tennis at all. So in that instance, absolutely, I would say, time away to work through that could be beneficial.
Thank you for that question, Adam. It reminds me as well of when my children went through certain phases where their behaviour on court was pretty unacceptable, in my opinion. A coach once said to me, look, they're frustrated, it's tough, they're problem solving. You don't have to swoop in and sort of save them from that. They need to work it through. But sometimes the behaviour did seem to be over the top. But I think in hindsight, it was often connected to a stage of development they were going through with something like a serve, for example. So if their first serve wasn't going in and they knew they had a very weak second serve, they would get increasingly frustrated knowing that they were going to get that second serve hammered back at their feet. And that frustration would boil over. So in a way, that was what, by talking to them afterwards, that's what drove them towards solving those problems, because the frustration was connected to that. But no, Camilla gave some very good advice there in terms of trying to get to the bottom of what it is that's making that frustration. Because I think unless you've got that information, you're in the dark a bit to it, aren't you? Emily, would you like to come off mute? I think you've got a question you'd like to ask.
Yeah, hi, Kay and Camilla. Firstly, Kay, thank you for organising this, and Camilla, it's lovely to meet you and hear some of your background actually and what you've got out of tennis, as well as some really useful advice. It's possible you might have answered this already, but I'm going to be a bit greedy and see whether there's anything else you can offer up.
Go ahead.
My daughter is kind of at the stage in her tennis this year where she's come on quite a lot quite quickly. And she has had like the last 4 or 5 tournaments where she's been drawn against the first or second seed. And she likes to kind of know and look at who she's playing and what she's going to kind of turn up to. And we've actually found in the last couple of tournaments, so not all of the 4 or 5, but in the last couple of tournaments, she's almost talked herself out of performing, even if it's meeting her own goals, which are not to do with winning, because the gap is, sometimes 400 places or 300 places. And I just wonder whether you had anything specific on top of what you've already said about how we as parents can frame it, because even today it was like, well, set yourself 2 goals and go and try and practice what you've been learning in your one-to-ones and your training, and you've got a free hit today. This girl is so good, you've got a free hit. We didn't say go and enjoy it, because I totally agree with you, it's not easy to enjoy that situation, but it's almost like she's beating herself before she even gets on the court. So anything specific you can share that would help me and my husband chat with my daughter beforehand?
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough. It's really tough. I'm reflecting on, the number of times when I'd see the draw and I'd be like, I'm not sure what the point of going to this tournament is. This is me out in the first round. But actually, I think it sounds like you're doing great things in terms of trying to set those goals. But I would say that potentially it's about trying to work with her to really think about, okay, this is my opportunity to go out and show exactly what I can do. So, maybe not framing it so much as it's an opportunity to kind of, play around and have a hit. I know that's not what you said, but like to go out and say, look, I'm going to see if in this situation I can execute a game plan exactly as I would want it to be. Where, there is an opportunity to sort of try not to just go out and try what I've been practicing, but to be really clear in terms of, well, this girl has these things that they're really good at. I'm going to go out and see if I'm able to find a weakness or, exploit a certain shot. So I would say you could almost double down on the trying to prep for it. So doing the opposite of kind of going, it doesn't matter because it's the number one seed, and saying actually it is the number one seed. So this is your chance to go out and Kay's used the word kind of problem solve and really see what you can do in terms of demonstrating that. I think it's also worth saying, that the more times you go out and play these and the more that you go and you fight and you get really good at kind of being in these battles, then when you get to those matches where you're more comfortable, you've obviously picked up a lot of skills and a lot of, learnings that you can take into those. So I think it's about really trying to help her understand that if you're going to go and play the match, then you play it with purpose. And that would be my rule on anything, training or matches. There's no point just going to training with no purpose. There's no point going to a match with no purpose, because otherwise it is literally a waste of time. So you go with a purpose and you have I would shift it from goals to what is my purpose? Like, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this match? And if at the end of the match you can come away and say, I've achieved my purpose, which might have been, I'm going to run really hard for 2 hours or an hour, or I'm going to chase every ball down, or, the purpose of this, what is the thing I want to try and learn from this experience? That might just help with that kind of shift in focus and really spending time thinking about that purpose and how you might go about executing it. So I don't have anything hugely different to what you said, but I think it's about that recognition of, if you show up with a purpose, it becomes a learning opportunity. If it's a learning opportunity, it's valuable. If it's valuable, do it well. Is kind of the piece in it together for me.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, you're welcome.
I would add to that I play tennis myself to club standard, but when I play a singles match and I know I'm going to get beaten, because to be honest, you kind of know, don't you? But you can challenge yourself to get a certain number of games, but again, you can't really control that, can you? It's not, you can't control the score. But one of the things that I find is that you can't really help yourself but experience an emotion of frustration. If you serve a serve and someone slaps it back at you, then you are annoyed about that and you do feel frustrated, but it's how quickly you can let go of that. So perhaps challenging a child to say, I wonder how well you can cope when all of those emotions arise. How quickly can you let go? Can you try to get your next first serve in, for example, even though you're feeling incredibly frustrated about the point? So what are the techniques for letting go, if you like, of that frustration? And in this match, you're going to experience that lots of times, because that's the nature of the match you're going to play. And then that's going to be really helpful for you when you're in a match that's really super close, because you're going to have practiced how to let go when perhaps you've just lost a set point and you need to go again at deuce and see if you can get back to that point. So that would be something perhaps I would suggest from my experience as well on that one.
That's a great suggestion, Kay. And as you were talking there, I was also thinking, I don't know how old your daughter is, Emily, but there's also those great opportunities, as Kay said, you've got those opportunities for learning based on the experience that you've had. But there's also loads and loads of examples, especially even, when you look at the elite game, of where the wild card has upset the seed, and, you never know what's quite possible. So, if you're in there fighting, if you're managing that frustration, if you're seeing those learning opportunities, you never know what kind of opportunities will open up for you.
Yeah, I'll keep plugging away with her. I think I got away with that whole wild card scenario for the first two tournaments, but third, fourth, and fifth, it's wearing a bit thin now. But yeah, you guys have given me some thoughts, and she's just started to play up. She's still under 12, but she's playing up to under 14. So we've also said to her the gap is going to be bigger, and that's okay. But you can keep fighting. You want to keep fighting. So we'll see how it goes. But thank you both, much appreciated.
And I would just say on that, and Emily, if you're finding with playing up, there's always those really challenging matches, then almost kind of related a little bit to Adam's question. not being afraid to drop back down and having those kind of giving her those opportunities to have those matches that are a little easier, or to get a little feel like she's getting a bit more of that kind of success isn't a terrible thing either. We don't always have to be pushing. Actually, sometimes learning to win when you're the person expected to win is really, really valuable.
Yeah, and you can reflect on the pressure you feel in those scenarios, can't you? And think, well, that's possibly the way my opponent's feeling when I'm the underdog. A parent was asked for general advice on how to be supportive of their boys when they're not able to help them with their actual training. I think we've kind of covered that, haven't we? Because this person doesn't actually play tennis themselves, but we've given a lot of advice on that. I think some more will come out as we go along. So I'm going to ask instead whether a parent's asked me to say, do you think that they should attend their child's one-to-one lessons? I guess there's a safeguarding element to that question nowadays as well. Perhaps that didn't exist so much when I was supporting my children. What what's the balance between that independence, Camilla, and the sort of need to be safe and attending one-to-ones?
I would ask your child, especially depending, if they're getting older. I think safeguarding absolutely a key thing, and I think, knowing that you could pop in or that you could show up at different points is always valuable. There's absolutely a benefit of being around for some of a session to get a sense of what's being worked on, because as a parent, you will inevitably talk to your child about what they're working on. And so it's good to know what they're working on and to maybe have had an opportunity to talk to the coach and kind of get aligned on messaging. But the research is really mixed. So some kids really like their parents present at everything. Some children, training is for them and it's their opportunity to just go out and have some fun and play free and do all that learning without feeling like anyone's watching them whilst they're trying to learn. So, I would absolutely have that conversation with a child and try as much as you can to be child-led in that, whilst, as you said, Kate, absolutely being aware of, potential safeguarding challenges. But, it would be one where I would say giving your child a choice and giving them some freedom in there, I think would be valuable.
I think it's one of the things we learned through the tennis parents community on Facebook, that one of the ideas behind the group was to join parents together to share their own experiences and their own advice. But equally, it's down to an individual parent to decide how they interpret that for their particular scenario, right? Because they might have a different budget, they might have a different amount of time to give, their child might be have siblings or not, or they might live in a rural area, in a city area. So there's no one size fits all, really, is what we're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was that, when I was growing up, there was times when I absolutely wanted my dad to be there. Sometimes I couldn't even tell you if he was there or not, like I was paying very little attention. And then sometimes I was frustrated because he'd missed it because I'd hit this awesome shot and I'd really wanted him to see that one time that I would hit that shot that I would never hit again in my life. But the one thing that you do learn from teenagers, especially when we've done research, is they recognize that parents are going to kind of get it wrong. They're much more forgiving than they let out. And actually they recognize, when I've talked to tennis players especially, and they're like, well, if I'm playing well, then I want my parent to do this. But if I've played slightly well and this bit's gone wrong, then I want them to do this. And if I had a good day at school and then I've gone to training and this has happened, then I would like them to do this. And they recognize that they're wanting different things all of the time. And as parents, we're trying to do the same thing all of the time, as opposed to maybe like just reading the situation. If your child has come out of school and they seem particularly frustrated, it's a chance to go, seems like maybe you might want some time on your own. Do you want to go and play? Do you want to practice like alone? Do you want me to be there or not? So I think, not being afraid to adapt and to change if you can, as you said there, Kay, you might be navigating multiple siblings or work schedules or, those sorts of things. But, I think not assuming that what you've done the last week that seemed to be well received is what you need to do this week, I think is important, especially as, as your children get older.
God, this is tough, isn't it? Who'd be a parent? So I mean, we've accepted that parents have got this huge role to play in tennis, but what's your general thoughts on the balance between what this expression over involved, this sort of pushy parent and so forth? Tell us a bit about that, and especially with your background in safeguarding, I guess that's again a little bit entwined with that.
Yeah, so from a research perspective, we don't talk about over-involvement at all. So it was a term that really developed in the 90s. And actually, you can be really over-involved, as in heavily involved, and do a brilliant job. Or you could be really low in involvement, so under-involved, and do a brilliant job. It's about the quality of the involvement that's really important. So, fundamentally, you might have a child who wants their parent present at everything. And so, from an external view, it might look like they're over involved, but actually, they're asking great questions. They're being led by their child. They're keeping it in perspective. They are acknowledging their own emotions. They might be doing a great job. So this idea of the over involved parent really, it really winds me up, if I'm honest, because it's an external judgment on a parent based on an assumption that if you're present, you must be doing something wrong. So fundamentally for me, it's about behaviors, right? So in tennis, over-involved parent typically means that you've done something that a coach finds frustrating, which might mean that you've asked too many questions in their eyes, or you are interfering in training. That's typically what it means in a tennis setting. So then it's actually about having an honest conversation with a coach to try and make sure that you've got a good parent coach relationship. And to do that, it's about trust, respect, and communication. Do you as a parent trust your child's coach? Do you trust that they have your child's best interest in heart, that they are trying to support your child to develop in the long term, not in the short term, that they're recognizing them as we would say a whole person, so they're not just focusing on their athletic development, they're focusing on their development as a person. If you trust that they're doing that, then you're doing really well. You've got a good foundation for a relationship. If you don't trust those things, you probably want to have a think about, has something gone wrong in the relationship which has led you to not trust them, or have you not had opportunities to have conversations for you to develop that trust? The next thing is respect, right? So as a parent, you need to receive respect from a coach. You need to be recognized for what you bring and the valuable role that you play. So we will always talk about parents as part of the team. And absolutely, you are part of the team. Without parents, as we said at the beginning, there's no tennis. So it's about recognizing you as part of the team, and you as a parent fully respecting the coach and recognizing what your roles are. So, I've spent a lot of time doing workshops with parents and workshops with coaches. And one of the things I always do is put scenarios on the table. And then I say to parents and coaches, like, whose role is this? And some are really obvious. And then some I purposely put in and they're a bit trickier. And it requires a parent and a coach to talk about it and actually, recognizing those roles, reflecting on when you think as a parent, you've maybe overstepped or not done, what you're allowed, like your kind of role requires. And similarly for a coach is really, really key. And ultimately, you've got to be able to think about how you communicate. So we would often talk about the 48-hour rule. So not contacting within 24 hours of a situation which has upset you, but making sure you do it within 48 hours so that it's not kind of like hanging over for too long. Talking about how you and the coach want to communicate, what's best for doing that. Not firing off the texts after a couple of glasses of wine in an evening. I think if you can nail the parent-coach relationship, then that kind of stereotypical over-involved is probably reduced. And then the other piece is obviously what's being perceived by your child. So research will show, for instance, that the higher the proportion of the family income that gets spent on sport, the more pressure a child perceives, even if it's not discussed with them. They understand how much is being invested. So it's around recognizing that there's kind of subtle behaviors that might get communicated. It's really busy trying to find time to fit this sport in, or oh my God, I don't want to have to go away again this weekend, or we really need to think about how much this is costing. It's those sorts of comments that are, and those sorts of behaviors that are much more impactful than just whether you're showing up to training or not and how much you're doing it. So I would, say worry less about amounts of involvement and think much more about the quality of the interactions that you're having both with coaches and with your child.
I absolutely recognise that one from behaviour I've seen courtside recently, where parents have said to me, if he's going to turn up and not even try, I'm not going to waste all my time at my weekend and all the money we're spending on this. And hopefully they're not saying that to their child, but that's absolutely something that a parent feels, isn't it? When they're invested in something to the extent that we all are in our children's tennis. It's a very tricky one, isn't it, to sort of absorb those feelings and not share them with the child.
Yeah, absolutely. And fundamentally, and I laugh with my partner a little bit about it, a little bit tongue in cheek, because I've spent so long researching this, so I absolutely get it. But, I'll often say to my friends, "Oh, what are you doing this weekend?" "Oh, we've got football and then rugby and then we've got this." And I want to go, you signed them up for it. Like you as the parent made the choice. And I know I remember a parent saying, you get on the hamster wheel and then you can't get off, because when do you say to your child, no, enough is enough, like I don't want to do it anymore? Like you can't. But I think it is about recognizing that often as a parent you started it and your child might be continuing it, but taking a little bit of ownership over it and recognizing that actually we started on this journey. And granted, you might not have known where the journey was what was going to go. But if you provide those opportunities for your child, absolutely you can expect, you can have a conversation about effort, but you can have a conversation about effort without tying it to money or tying it to time. You can talk about, as a family, we value effort. You don't have to, bring those things in. But it's really hard not to let those things seep out. And that's what, we find in the research. The more stress you're experiencing as a parent, the harder it is to parent in a positive way, right? There's loads of research on parenting stress that shows that the higher the levels of stress, the more punitive your engagement is with your child. So that might be stress from the sport, but it might be work stress, family stress. As those things build, it can be hard to sort of shake it. But recognizing that you might say something and that not land exactly as you would want it to, or in hindsight you realize that might have given the wrong message. Being comfortable to have a conversation, say, I realize I said this and it might have been interpreted this way. I just want you to know, actually, I love the time that we have. I love all of, you know, the investment. I can get frustrated. I think, as parents, we get it wrong. I get it wrong on a daily basis. I get it more right when I try and correct what I did wrong. And I think, we shouldn't underestimate the power that can have in sort of reducing pressure.
That leads us on really nicely, Camilla, to ask about your advice for making sure that tennis doesn't take over family priorities, especially when one or more siblings aren't actually involved in the sport. And also when it creeps into school time and the children end up spending less time at school and more time on the tennis court. What are your thoughts about that?
It's really tricky. It comes back to that first point we said, right? As parents, you have a lot of decisions to be making. But I think, recognizing the reasons for being involved in things is really, really key. And I think, when you're making decisions to prioritize tennis over other things, then you need to be aware of what you might be missing out on when you're prioritizing tennis and what other siblings might be, missing out on. And I think, ultimately, there's always another tournament, there's always another opportunity, there's always another train session. You can always do more, right? It is the difference to having a scheduled league match where you have, one match. You can always do more and more tennis. But I think it's about recognizing, fundamentally as parents, our role, I believe, is to create like well-rounded human beings. And that's not just the one who plays tennis, that's every sibling within a family. And recognizing that if you're overly prioritizing tennis over other things, what impact that might be having on kind of other areas of development. And I think if you start to feel uncomfortable about it as a parent, then you've probably made that decision like already. And sometimes we don't like to hear it, or we don't like to feel it, but there's no perfect balance. For some families one decision might work, and for others another decision might work. And some families, parents are working multiple jobs, they've got multiple siblings, they just cannot kind of commit the time or the money. The other parents will but it comes back to that very beginning point I made around, you know, your own journey and not comparing. So I think, you know, I can't sit here and go, you know, 40% do this and 60% do this. It is about, you know, fundamentally recognizing, you know, what impact you want to have on your child, but keeping in mind that holistic development of your child. You know, ultimately, most people aren't going to go on and become elite tennis players. And the more that you commit to tennis, you know, the more time, the more money, as I said, you know, the more that can start to get interpreted as pressure. So, you know, keeping that balance as you can, keeping that conversation really clear with your child who's involved in tennis. And if you have other children who aren't, you know, making sure that you know, you're talking to those as well. My sister will still say that tennis is a banned topic of conversation in our house. And I didn't even play as much as, you know, most of the people I grew up with. But, you know, for the longest time, she felt like it dominated in our family. And I wasn't aware of that really as a child. That was just, you know, what I was doing, and I would keep doing it. So I think, you know, making time for family time. And actually, in research that we've done with young children, like 8 to 10-year-olds, when we asked them what they would really like from their parents in relation to their sport at home, they said, we don't want to talk about it. We just want quality family time. We want a parent who listens to us. We want a parent who's there with us, who plays with us, who prioritizes family time. So children know that that's what they want. I think sometimes as adults, we're the ones who can get sucked into this opportunity and this opportunity and this opportunity. But more opportunities aren't always better.
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? I always tell the story that I was on that sort of track of we mustn't miss a tournament, we must get the ranking points. And then my child got injured and was out for about a year. And then they went back in right at the same level very, very quickly to where they were when they stopped playing. And I thought, gosh, you know, I didn't think we could miss a weekend, and we've just almost missed a whole year, and it didn't really seem to make that much difference. So it was a stage where they were all growing anyway and changing shape and size, and it even possibly was a good thing. So, you know, gave the body a rest, gave the mind a rest, and came back really hungry to get back on the court. So, you know, it can seem when you're in that moment that it's the most important thing. And of course, you know, there's different answers to that question depending on the level of your child as well, you know. If we're talking about a child that is seriously going to have an opportunity to pro career, then it might be a little bit different.
But you know, rest is such an important one, and tennis is weird for this idea that, like, and I remember it vividly, like if you don't play for a day, you'll have forgotten how to play the next day. Like it's this really strange, and there's no other, I've never come across another sport where we feel this incessive need to, like, oh, I need to play every single day or the ball just won't feel right. Like we've all talked ourselves into that, I think, the tennis community, because there's no reason why you would forget how to play overnight. And you know, in most other sports, and you know, especially from like a physical training perspective, rest is absolutely critical. That opportunity for, you know, those kind of physiological adjustments to take place, as you say, Kate, for the mental kind of rest. And also it's a good thing to get used to coming off a couple of days away, or you know, not having played back-to-back tournaments, because if you are, you know, fortunate to have the luck and all of the other opportunities go in your favor to make it as an elite player, you might have a tournament that you get knocked out of first round, and then you hadn't scheduled one for the next week, and then suddenly it's kind of 2 weeks off playing, and you know, you're going to go and play, or you know, you do a few weeks of getting knocked out early in the draw and you haven't had matches and you've got to come in. So you know, this idea that you're playing all of the time as a junior isn't actually setting you up necessarily for kind of that elite career, if that's what you're going for. But also, you know, like I played hundreds, thousands of matches, 98% of which I don't remember. They would have seemed like the most important thing at that time, and I absolutely couldn't miss that tournament. But I do remember the weekends when I wasn't playing tournaments and I was doing other things and hanging out with my family and, you know, seeing friends. So, you know, I think it comes back to, you know, that recognition of the importance of very varied experiences to develop as a whole person.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we can perhaps look at a question now that I'm super interested in from a broader perspective. I'd like to know if you've noticed any a difference culturally in what parental support looks like. For example, some people believe that they have a duty to sort of force their child, or rather than just encourage them to play sport, because that's the only way that they'll develop a passion that sustains healthy choices going forwards. Whereas other people would see that as being pushy or even living vicariously through a child. What's your thoughts on that?
Fundamentally, if we want a child to want to do anything, a child needs to start off wanting to do it. Absolutely, as a parent, you're going to be the person who provides those opportunities, right? You know, there's no 5-year-old who's signing themselves up for a club. They might be the ones who say, I would like to play this sport, but you know, you're going to put those opportunities in front of them. But you know, if they don't want to do it, they don't want to do it. And we can push and push and push. But you know, as I said at the beginning, you know, when I went to Loughborough, the number of players who I grew up with who, as soon as the parent wasn't there, stopped playing because they'd been doing it because that was something that they did, not because they were necessarily choosing to do it. Um, you know, it is always really revealing to me. So, you know, like obviously there will be times where you know you might have a child who is really really motivated, and then for whatever reason they're going through a patch where they're not super keen on going to training, and you know maybe you drop training down a little bit, or you talk to them to try and understand it, and you know you see if you can commit through this period, and then see what happens. But you know fundamentally, if you want a child to be, you know, enjoying what they're doing, and if they enjoy it, they're much more likely to continue doing it, then they have to have some degree of autonomy, and they have to have some degree of choice over what they're doing. You know, as my belief is that as parents you can put those opportunities in front of them, but you absolutely, if you're feeling that you're having to force them to do it, then at some point they're probably going to try and find an opportunity to leave the sport.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some other nations perhaps have a different view on that, don't they? But you still hold that's the right choice in the longer term. But you know, if I could liken that to say a musical instrument, you know, there may be children who don't really want to practice and practice and practice, but are very grateful if you push them through that process and they come out the other side and can play an instrument.
Yeah, and I think so, there's a broad thing around parenting styles, you know, and they're in different cultures, different parenting styles are more or less beneficial than they are in kind of a westernized British culture, where we typically see that an authoritative kind of autonomy supportive parenting style typically is associated with more positive outcomes, and so that is where you kind of put boundaries in place, but yet your child has some choice within them, and they are a kind of an active agent in the decisions that they make. That's typically where we would see the most positive. That's not to say that you wouldn't have the rare occasion where there are kind of you know, positive consequences from different parenting styles, but it's around, you know, I would say that the majority of research would suggest, you know, at least in a Western kind of British culture, that having children having a degree of autonomy is most likely to lead to positive outcomes. That's not to say you won't have athletes who become elite athletes from a different kind of parenting style or a different background. It's just whether you'll get negative other outcomes alongside it, which is
Ah, yes. So you might end up with a pro player, but they might absolutely hate the parents, or yeah,
yeah,
which we've seen in the pro circuit. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. One of the parents has asked me to ask you about tips for supporting a child over the long journey that is from the beginning at perhaps 5 or 6, and then all the way through to hopefully either US college or UK university or even the pro circuit. And can you sort of break down how that relationship looks and some tips over that long journey, how it sort of evolves? I know we've touched on this a bit, but is there anything else you?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that first stage, kind of don't quote these ages as set because it will vary on different children. But you know, those early years, kind of 6 to 10, 6 to 11, love of sport, right? It needs to be getting them excited about playing tennis, enjoying all of the different elements of it, really instilling a belief in their abilities, helping them understand that you value their participation. So, you know, you're going to be providing everything: food, money, water, travel, time, emotional support. You're going to be providing all of it, but really, really emphasizing, you know, it's about going out, having fun, enjoying it, really learning to love tennis, learning to love the challenge. As a parent, really keeping it in perspective. Young children, I have a 6-year-old. Today has been both his worst and his best day ever in the space of 5 minutes, right? We as parents can react to the emotions that children have. They forget it in a very short period of time. So I think it's really remembering that it's the child's experience at that point, you know, that it is a 6-year-old child. Don't put adult emotions on their emotions. Their emotions are more basic. They are up and down, and they move on. So love of the sport and really instilling competence. So this belief that they're good, this belief that they, you know, that they, if they're working hard and they're training hard, that they're developing their skills, not that they're going to go on and be a Wimbledon champion, but helping them to, you know, feel physically competent is really important. When you get to kind of 11, 12, what we typically see in children is that they tend to become, they become more realistic in their understanding of their competence. They get a better judge of kind of how other people are doing, and you know, where they kind of rank up against each other. They also suddenly find themselves at secondary school and in a situation where they're getting evaluated a lot. So you can see this kind of dip in competence or perceptions of competence as their competence perceptions become more realistic. So as a parent there, it's around recognizing there might be some wobbles, some loss in confidence, really helping them to focus on themselves, to set their own goals, to see their own improvement, working really with the coach now. So the coach-parent relationship starts to become a key one. How can I reinforce the messages from the coach? How can I start to take the lead from my child, give them some autonomy? So give them the chance to choose between a couple of tournaments, give them the chance to choose between kind of a tournament and a weekend off. So you already start to take a little bit of a step back. Role modeling is really key here. So, you know, recognizing that, you know, if you're getting really stressed out and anxious about tournaments, your child's probably going to pick up on that. If your behavior is really different when they win to when they lose, they'll pick up on that as well. And that's one that actually I think sometimes we as parents miss, is that, you know, sometimes our excitement can also, whilst they're excited, if we're really excited, oh, you go out and celebrate because they've won and this is wonderful and they've beaten the number 1 seed or they've done this, and so let's celebrate it. But then you don't do anything when you lose, but you tell them it doesn't matter if they win or lose. But then you've just communicated it in a different way. So role modeling kind of what you would like them to see as important is key. Once you get to sort of 15, 16, your job as a parent is really continue to finance, and unfortunately that can go on until mid 20s, 30s if your child stays in tennis. And emotional support. It's just being there as the emotional support. Really, at that point, you want your child to be driving a lot of their own decisions. That doesn't mean they wouldn't talk to you about the decision, and it doesn't mean that you can't be a sounding board and kind of giving them an opportunity to think through different scenarios. But, you know, 16 onwards, we would really expect, you know, not expect, we would really, the research would suggest that letting a child start to kind of have some autonomy to draw on their support network, but, you know, make those decisions is typically the most useful.
That's fantastic advice across the whole spectrum there. And I could sort of, looking back at my relationship with my kids as they went through, there was a sort of natural progression, not just because I thought that was the right thing to do, but the child recognized that as well. And like you say, the peer pressure, you know, and talking to each other suddenly about their parents' behavior courtside, where you've been around the circuit as long as they have, but suddenly your roles changed and now the thing gets a bit more pointed, you know. Your mum's a bit nuts, isn't she? Sort of conversations on other kids. And luckily, I don't think, well, I certainly never overheard that one, but perhaps it was said. But this sort of idea that they become closer bonded as a community of tennis players, and they know each other so well, having grown up together, and they kind of know, don't they, where it sits. And I always think, you know, my advice to a young parent is just be careful of that, because it will come back to bite you if you're doing the odd stuff when they're a bit younger. Then that, you know, that does, they, when they grow up, they do start to discuss that, and they've all noticed it. So yeah, it's a
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes ever from a study, and it was in a team sport, but it was it was looking at some volleyball players, and one of the girls just going, you just don't want to look over and be like, oh, I'm so embarrassed, that's my parent. And she went on to describe it, you know, my parent's always the one in the red jumper, so they always stand out and they're cheering, and it's so embarrassing. I just don't want that. And you know, we often get caught up on like the pushy parents, the shouting, those sorts of things. But for a teenager, especially, embarrassment is, you know, sky high. And it comes back to the point that I hope I've made sufficiently, but it's about understanding your individual child and talking to them. And just because someone else's parent does something, that doesn't mean it's right for you and your child's relationship. And there's so many factors that impact on how children perceive your behaviors, that if you're not talking to them regularly about it and being ready to hear their feedback, right? You can't say, do you like what I'm doing? And if they say no, then getting frustrated at them, you know, really hearing them, and looking at how you can adapt. You know, that's absolutely, you know, the key to succeeding over a long period of time.
just flipping then back to the environment a bit more. You know, we've sometimes in these conversations we can feel like we're beating parents up a little bit, can't we, for their inadequacies? But I know you've spoken in the past, Camilla, about parents feeling judged by the success or failure of their child, and also the idea that became prevalent that whether or not your child is coachable reflects on you as well as a parent. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, it frustrates me no end. Your child is your child, right? Like, and they come with their quirks and their nuances and all of those different things. And as parents, we're just trying to make the best of it. You know, absolutely, are there, you know, other things that you can influence? Yes. Other things that you probably can't influence half as much as people think that you can? Yes. So I think, you know, for me, that's really important first and foremost as a parent, is to recognize that, you know, your child is not just a reflection of you as a parent. They're a reflection of society. They're a reflection of schooling, education. You know, absolutely do we play a role in how they're raised? You know, 100% we do, but we're raising them within certain parameters that influence what we can do, and, you know, and the impacts that they have. So, you know, think, you know, as a parent, that's really, really important. And, you know, one of the things that's really frustrated me around the kind of whole sport parent movement is this idea that people have kind of argued that, um, you know, there's all these signs, you know, whether your child wins or loses is not a reflection on you as a parent, but whether they're resilient, coachable, well-mannered, etc., all of those things are. But that's just more judgment on parents, you know, and I think fundamentally parents are trying to do the very best that they can. I do not know any parent who gets up in the morning and goes, today I'm going to be a really bad parent, or today I'm going to really try and upset my child, right? Everyone's trying to do the best they can, but especially in the youth sport environment, it's hugely emotionally charged. You have people trying to make money from it. It's an industry ultimately. So you have more and more people will offer services because, you know, if we can get them playing when they're one, then why not? Because that means we can get more income, and we can try and, you know, get them going. I'm being somewhat sarcastic there. You know, fundamentally, youth sport is a professionalized, privatized industry. And as parents, you are buying into that industry. With every session that you buy, and so then more sessions get made available, more tournaments become available, because they are kind of, you know, avenues for income. And so, you know, the environment, the culture, it's hugely competitive. You know, there's rankings and there's ratings and there's, you know, all these kind of judgments around what everyone's doing. And with the very best of intentions, you know, researchers have looked at this. You know, you ask parents what their goals are for their kids when they start school, they start sport, and within one season, they've changed entirely. So they started with wanting to be social, wanting to make friends, be healthy, learn to love a sport. And within one competitive season, it started to become about getting selected for certain teams or reaching certain rankings, even without the meaning to, because the environment leads to parents getting kind of caught up in it. And, you know, for me, ultimately, we need to fundamentally change culture of youth sport. Sport needs to be on, less of a pedestal. We need to take away, the emphasis on outcomes from such an early age, and then we'll start to see some shifts. And also, I now work for a charity that works with children living in poverty, and those children don't have any of these opportunities. They don't have any of the opportunities to kind of go out and compete and have access to kind of learning, opportunities and development and extracurricular activities. That doesn't mean those parents are doing anything wrong either, right? That's a consequence of circumstance. And so I think, we have to really recognize parenting exists in a social environment. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. Sorry, that one gets me on my high horse. I can talk on that one for a long time.
No, I'm also a big advocate of trying to change the environment, and not necessarily the parent. I mean, yes, we have to take responsibility for our behaviours, and sometimes not be a victim, if you like. But at the same time, parents can actually impact the environment that their child's playing in. That's again coming back to our conversation about in tennis how we are, and in a unique sport, in that you don't have to be selected by county to become a pro player. It's not the only route. Obviously it can help, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the only route. So you do have a choice, but equally this environment that's created by the sport is something that we can impact and affect through the volunteering structures and in clubs, by becoming officials who run tournaments, and by continuing engaging with the governing body to try to explain the experience that we're having and how that's impacting our children and our lives. So I'm a big fan of not automatically blaming parents and saying, well, parents' behaviour is X, Y, Z, but to actually look at why and say, why is it that parents are doing the things they're doing? Because believe me, I didn't ever wake up and think, I know I need to drive my child from Bath to Norwich for one match. But that's what I was looking at doing at one point, and that was definitely the environment that created that. That wasn't what I particularly signed up for, and if considered to be a terrible parent if I didn't do that, and so I think we do need to look at the systems that are in place and whether those are particularly set up for performance and are dragging everybody else along with that journey, just so we can find the next pro players that will stimulate participation in sport, because we know that's definitely what happens if we have successful players like Henry Patton and today, spoiler alert, but that will encourage people to play tennis. But the journey that our children go on doesn't necessarily have to be a pro triangle, if you like, where only the few get to the top. In the sport,
No,
it's a lifelong sport with so many benefits.
and also, I don't even think if we know if that's the best journey to go on either, like that idea. My dad was a teacher, and we used to drive from Plymouth to Heston to play 2 matches on a Sunday night and get home at midnight. I can't even believe he did it, but it was this pressure of like, well, if I don't play this, then I might not get enough wins to then get my rating up. And I was a bit old, rankings were only coming in as I was sort of finishing up, but you could look at that and go, what? Well, your dad was choosing to do that. Well, it probably came from me saying, no, Dad, I need to do this because when I'm at training, everyone's talking about doing this, and the environment is set up in this way to do this. And so, absolutely, it's around recognizing, but it's around reflecting on, do we really need to be holding as many tournaments as we're holding for young people, and also, recognizing. I think there's that perception, and absolutely, it was the experience I had of you need to go far, like you need to travel, and the local tournaments or the tournaments where, in Devon we didn't always have loads of tournaments of like certain levels. You don't want to keep playing the same people. In hindsight now, with all I know, there's absolute value to winning the easy matches, right? Like to learning to win when you're ahead. There's absolute value of going out and playing the same person multiple weeks and knowing that you might have won one week and now you've got to work out how to play them again the next week. There's all sorts of values that come from, you don't always have to travel 5 hours away to play someone different. And I think, all of that comes to the environment and the ideas that kind of perpetuate within the setting.
You've touched on it there, and that a child perhaps could end up with some kind of sports related anxiety or burnout. What are the signs to watch for as a parent if you think your child's not just not doing very well at coping today, but is actually it's become a much bigger problem?
Yeah, I think, I think it's around recognizing kind of when there's kind of shifts that happen over a long period of time, right? So if they get anxious leading into a match and then actually once they're in the match is fine, or after a match, they're fine, then that's one thing. But if you're finding that actually every time they're going out to play, and then if it becomes part of going to training as well, that they're experiencing anxiety, or they're suggesting they don't want to go, or you're seeing physical changes in them that might be changes in kind of what they're eating, or how hard they're trying, or what they're kind of focusing on, or you're seeing behavioral shifts. Maybe they're less talkative, maybe they don't want to talk about the matches so much, maybe they don't want to talk about training, maybe they're not engaging with people as much. As soon as you start to see these kind of consistent patterns, and again, apologies because I know this is probably getting frustrating, it'll depend on the individual child. So you might have a child who's quite quiet anyway, and actually what you suddenly see is they're really chatty and they're really gregarious, and they're really over the top, because that might be their way of compensating. Or you might have someone who's usually quite chatty and they become more withdrawn about it. So it's around kind of, if you're seeing kind of shifts in behavior over more of an extended period of time, and really listening. Most kids probably will say they don't want to go to training one day, but if they're saying they don't want to go to training multiple days, multiple weeks, and they just don't really know why, or they just don't want to compete, then those are the things to be looking out for. So it's basically what you'd be looking out for in one match, but over an extended period of time.
And is it a sports psychologist that could help with that, or is it not really relevant to go down that route and just literally perhaps?
No, absolutely a sports
or I don't
No,
know.
absolutely a sports psychologist. So I'm a big believer that everyone should work with a psychologist in all situations and in all cases. But no, absolutely, and I think, tennis is tough. All sport is tough, but tennis is really tough, right? From a young age, you're out there on your own. Nobody can help you. You can feel really exposed. Helping young people to, have some strategies to cope, to, have a bit of, have some perspectives to draw on when things are feeling tough is always going to be beneficial. And I think I'm absolutely an advocate for, if you're getting physical training and you're getting technical training and you're getting tactical training, I don't know why you wouldn't be getting kind of support from a mental sort of psychological perspective, even before you get anywhere close to kind of big issues with anxiety or or burnout. But absolutely, if you do reach those points, I would 100% be recommending that you reach out to a sports psychologist, or someone with similar sort of credentials. But yeah, I think that's one of the things where we don't help young tennis players enough. I worked with a player who, when she got selected for GB, she was really young, and her question was like, is it okay to feel nervous? And these are simple questions that, like, absolutely it's okay. But if no one's talked to her about that, or what you do when you feel nervous when you're playing in a GB kit and you've never had that conversation before, this is tough, right? It's tough to go out not knowing the answer to that question. So as parents, you are the number one, like, you are the first person who can provide some advice and some guidance to your child around how to cope. But yeah, there's a growing network of sports psychologists who absolutely would be able to support as well.
And talking about that being a tough thing for a child, parents asked about neurodiversity as well, and their child doesn't cope well with counting the score, for example. Have you got any experience in that field?
I have to be really honest that it's not a space I've worked in a whole lot, but I can recommend there's a sports psychologist called Josie Perry, who has a book out specifically around sports psychology and neurodiversity, and she's done a number of talks on that. So that might be a good place to start. I wouldn't want to start going into it because I don't have that expertise, but I know Josie has written about it. Yeah, and like I say, it's been on a number of talks.
Thank you. Another parent talked about the role of a coach in this whole triangle, with the player and the parent as well. We're coming to the end of our time, but I just wonder if you wanted to touch on the work you've done and really wondering if coaches are being educated on how to deal with developing players, not just as tennis players, but as people as well.
Yeah, in my experience, it's really hit and miss depending on what training coaches have done and who they've kind of been exposed to. And, there's some great coaches out there who really understand this kind of holistic whole person development. And there's some who really don't. And, unfortunately, the nature of, coaching is that many coaches feel that they're judged by the success of their of players, and by success they mean kind of outcomes and progress, because that tends to attract maybe more people into their coaching business. But there is, in tennis and in all sports, there are some absolutely outstanding coaches who do recognize the value of holistic development, because they fundamentally feed into the same thing. Supporting a young person to develop all areas of their life ultimately helps performance, and vice versa. So, I don't think you can look at kind of one without looking at the other if you're really kind of committed to what you're doing. But, as a parent, I think it's a really important conversation to have with your child's coach early on. What is it that they're focusing on, and do they recognize it? And as a parent, having those conversations with your child as well, like, does your coach pay attention to other things that are going on? If you have a coach who's always suggesting that you train and you should never be studying for exams, for instance, they're probably not someone who is focused on that kind of holistic whole person development. So absolutely, they are fundamental to this. And we've talked here today very much about parents, but you said it, Kay, it is an athletic triangle. And if the relationship between a parent and a coach is good, then it makes for a better relationship with an athlete, a player. And similarly, it works all the way around. So, trying to find that time early on and regularly to have conversations with your child's coach, really around, are we all on the same page? What are we trying to achieve? What roles have we all got? And moving things forward together, I think is really important.
Camilla, you've come out of academia now and gone into working for Greenhouse Sport. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that before we say good evening?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, so as you said, I was at Swansea University for 13 years, and this area of research has been my absolute passion. And now I've moved to work in the charity sector, which has been a big shift. And Greenhouse Sports is a charity based predominantly in London, but also with a base in Portsmouth and Leicester. And we place evidence-based programs into schools to work with children who are living in areas of high deprivation, so kids who are living in poverty. And what it's made me reflect is that the research I've been doing today is a privilege, and that many children are living in really, really unfortunate circumstances right now, and they don't have access to any of the things that we've talked about. Having a parent who's maybe over involved in your sport, is not even on the radar if you can't get to sport and you have no money and you have no kit. So it's been really nice to shift across, and there's been some good learnings for me to transfer from the research I've been doing. But it would be one thing I would say, when we're getting worried about tennis, when we're stressing out about those rankings or those ratings, is recognizing that we're in a fortunate position to even be considering it, because there's many kids who can't, and families who aren't able to provide for that. So yeah, if you ever see, actually Greenhouse Sports is linked up with the LTA Tennis Foundation. So Greenhouse Sports has been around some of the different tournaments. So yeah, if you see it around, that's who I work for, and yeah, really passionate about what we're doing. So thank you.
No, it's great to see the LTA Foundation investing in what the LTA always talk about is tennis opened up and having something for everyone and everybody belonging in this sport. So great to see that they're actually putting some financial support to that through Greenhouse. That's great. That's great. Camilla, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. It's been absolutely fascinating. You've really challenged our thinking. Is there one thing that you would like to take every parent to take away with you at the end of the session?
I would just say, give yourself a break. Cut yourself some slack, that you're going to make mistakes along the way. But if you are striving to do the best for your child, and you're talking to them, and you're listening to what they want, and really trying to address that as best you can, then I think you're doing the best job you can.
Brilliant. On that note, Camilla Knight, thank you very much for your time. Thank you to everybody who attended, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Kay. Thanks, everybody.